Hello everyone, this is Rick and welcome to Astral Club. This podcast will be merging with animals and astral projection. Before we get started real quick, just want to mention Patreon. We have a couple new Patreon members I'd like to recognize. The first is Sandra Shelman, which is my best Norwegian pronunciation, I'm sure, with a heavy American accent. Thank you, Sandra. And she is an Astral Master, and Edward is also an Astral Master. And I'd like to thank them both for joining Patreon. And they will, of course, get advanced videos on Sunday, and we can talk back and forth on the Patriot email. They can ask questions and share their experiences with me. Next up, please make sure you have a solid bell. That way you'll always be notified when the Wednesday afternoon and Saturday morning episodes air. And hit that like button if you like this video. Okay, merging with animals and astral projection. Now, this is something that I wasn't aware was possible in my initial experimentations as a child. It probably wasn't until I got into my early teens that when I was very much interested in dinosaurs, that I went back around 75 million years or so in the past. And as I've indicated in a past episode, I saw a very large crocodilians who were, probably somewhere around 30 feet or so long, which probably translates into something like, I don't know, 9 meters, something like that. Let's just say very large. Let's just say their head was it was larger than my 13-year-old body. So they're pretty good sized beasts. I just thought about for a second as they were sunning themselves in the early morning, gaining heat for the day. I idly thought, geez, I wonder what that one's thinking. And then bam, I was immediately inside the body of this large beast. To say that it was a shock would be the understatement of the year. But I won't get into a lot of detail because I've discussed this before. But it was a new world, being able to access the thoughts of a creature which was completely alien to me. And I was able to see through its eyes, hear, smell, which was pretty amazing, and just get a sense for the primitive functions of its brain. Now, it was perfectly adapted for its environment, but from my standpoint, it seemed rather primitive. I could move its limbs, and I found that I could control the voluntary parts of it. However, I couldn't access the deep involuntary part of the brain that controls pain, pleasure, that type of thing, because that was beyond my control, much like it's beyond my control in my current physical body as a human. So that's one thing that's interesting about going into an animal. Now, that was a mistake. I mean, in that I hadn't meant to do so. Now, even as a young teenager, even as younger than that, I knew it was against all the rules to ever try something like that on a human, and I never have to this day, other than a couple of times when I've inhabited alternate versions of myself for relatively short periods of time. In other words, my vibrational frequency was close enough that I was able to enter my alternate selves. But even at that point, it was only for short periods of time, and I guess it was okay because it was just alternate versions of myself. But it started me thinking about other possibilities. Now, one question I do want to answer, because I don't want to forget, is occasionally people ask me, have you ever gone into any domestic pets, like dogs or cats? And I have to confess, I never have, because I've never tried. It never occurred to me. I guess I just wasn't interested in, going inside Mr. Button's body to sit there curled up in some warm corner, or to go into Fido's body, waiting for his dog food. I just it just never occurred to me that that would be interesting. And I don't have any pets as an adult, so it's not something that I ever considered experimenting with. It's always been wild animals, and I find that wild animals are fairly easy to merge with. They don't have that protective energy barrier that is around humans, and so it's fairly easy to do. You just have to make sure that you have strong will and that your identity is solid, because it can get murky when you start sharing consciousness with creatures that are very different from you. And there are side effects, which I've mentioned in the past and I'll comment on again. After the large crocodile, I had indicated that I had some weird side effects. For a few weeks afterwards, I had this craving for rotting meat. Luckily, I knew I couldn't actually do that because humans don't do very well with rotten meat, whereas crocodiles can handle it quite well. But I did have the craving. Next up, I tried going into the body of a relatively small fish, and it was dark in the ocean, and the fish was swimming as fast as it could. I could feel our fear because something large and predatory was chasing us. We could feel it. We could feel the currents and the eddies of the ocean, and we knew that it was getting closer and closer to us. And so there was just more and more fear that was building. And we felt this vacuum for a split second, which I believe was this giant fish opening its mouth and getting ready to swallow us. I jumped at that point because I had no particular desire to go through a death sequence being eaten alive by some huge predator. I didn't know what it was, because it was dark, and all I could do is I could feel the fish's fear. And we could sense that it was large and it was hungry and it was getting closer to us, and it was scary as hell. To try to get the other side of things, on another occasion, I jumped into a shark. And this shark was rather large. It was a modern day shark. And it was quite hungry. It was very hungry. And it was in the process of hunting down a seal. The brain itself was fairly, once again, basic. There's not a lot of higher thoughts going on here, but there was a predatory sense, a certain basic planning of how to attack this particular prey, knowing that it had to be taken by surprise because it was very quick and slippery. Whenever I'm in animals or fish, I typically, and I've learned now, not to try to seize control of the voluntary motions, the muscles, what have you, but to just audit the experience. Because trying to swim and breathe through gills, I tried that once and it was a mess. Because it's harder than it looks. And I'll say that again probably in a little bit. So I immediately backed off and just kind of audited the experience. And I could feel us approaching, and I could see the underside of the seal. And we opened up our maw, and our eyes rolled back. I couldn't see anything. And then we bit into the seal. And oh my goodness, the sensation of pleasure that occurred with the blood and the flesh. And what was strange about it was that we could sense the fat content when we bit into the seal. And it just gave us immense pleasure. At that point, I had to leave the shark's body because the pleasure was becoming too intense, and I wasn't prepared to experience that because I have to maintain my own will, my own control. And I can sample these animals' emotions and their feelings and what have you, but you can't allow yourself to get drawn in too deeply. You could lose sense of self, and that's a danger that you have to always be aware of. It's easier when you still have a physical body, because no matter what, you're going to get yanked back. But if you did this in between lives, you really want to have a very strong sense of self, because you could get drawn into a lower life form's thought process and lose yourself in the process. I also mentioned how in the distant past, probably somewhere around 5 million years, I don't recall exactly, when I went into the body of the megalodon. Now, that of course was a giant shark that died off several million years ago, and it could grow up to enormous sizes, basically the size of a Greyhound bus. Okay, look at it that way. And we weren't preying on anything at the time, but what I found so fascinating was to have this enormous body and the presence of this enormous body. It was so I mean, I'm used to my compact human form, but this thing was gigantic, and we swam very leisurely. We weren't in any hurry, and I didn't sense a lot of fear in this thing. And then again, when you're the size of a Greyhound bus and you have teeth the size of my hand, my guess is there aren't a lot of things for you to be afraid of. So this thing was just, cruising. It was mildly hungry, but it wasn't starving at the time. And it was down below, maybe 150 feet or so, just looking up, looking for anything to present itself. So that was my experience with the Meg. Getting into something more mammalian, which of course is always a little bit easier to understand, because the brains of other mammals are at least a little bit more the same or similar to human brains. So it's a little bit easier to deal with it. And I remember I went into the body of this cheetah-like animal. This was in the future. And I made the mistake of jumping in as it was running. And it was running very quickly. And for a minute, I made a mistake. And I just instinctively, I tried to control the running process. And we just ended up going head over heels because it was a real mess, trying to control four legs, galloping quickly. It was a predator. I would say it was cheetah-like, and but I could sense the mammalian emotions that we consider more mammalian. Although reptilians have demonstrated some interesting things too, so I don't want to shortchange them. But I could sense that it had cubs, that it was a female, that it was trying to feed itself, and to be able to feed its cubs, it had a certain amount of, let me use the word, affection for them. Perhaps bonding is a better word. And I don't want to anthropomorphize too much, even though it's pretty much a hazard here when you're talking about melding with animals. Once I went into a hawk. I knew right up front to just audit that experience, because I'm not going to try to fly on the wing, so to speak. And then, of course, there was the recent experience with the dinosaurs, where I literally went through several death experiences during that huge apocalypse, which happened when the Chicxulub crater was created by that giant asteroid about 66 million years ago. And as I said, some of the hazards of this occupation are side effects. I've mentioned how I had a craving for rotting meat for a bit. When I was in the various fish bodies, I had cravings for raw fish, and I don't mean sushi. I mean raw fish, as in bloody fish. I didn't really engage in that, but for a while, the idea of cooking and eating fish just was very distasteful to me. It felt like you were wasting it. And then, of course, the whole idea of raw and bloody meat, which, the cheetah and the hawk found very pleasurable. I think what they all had in common is they're all animals going on instinct, doing what they have to do to survive. And if you wish to share their experiences, you have to be very careful. You have to make sure you have a strong will and don't try to control the experience. Believe me, it's better off if you try to just audit it. In other words, share the consciousness, but don't try to control anything because it's a lot more difficult than you think. Anyway, that was the podcast. That's what I wanted to talk about. If you liked it, please hit the like button, share it with those of like minds, subscribe, and make sure that bell is a solid bell so you get the notifications. Please give me your questions and comments. They always give me great ideas and a lot of good information. And as always, this is Rick, and I will see you on the astral plane.